Hello everyone and welcome to Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history and world building. Before we get into our story, a few words about the miniature. This is Sonia, the Maine Coon fighter from Animal Adventures Tales of Cats and Catacombs. Let us continue down Roman roads. Last time we discussed about the time it would take for a military commander to redeploy their troops from one part of the empire into the other. We discussed about how all roads lead to Rome, and we also discussed about all the improvements that Romans brought to roads, especially here in Europe, ranging from milestones, public fountains and benches for people to take a breather while traveling. Now, we've also discussed about how Roman roads were laid out, planned, and how they were actually constructed, that they managed to survive until this day, and some of them still be in use. With that being said, I'm gonna tell you a few more details about Roman roads. First and foremost, archaeologists during multiple studies have surmised that Romans had one-way streets, they didn't have left-hand turns, and more often would drive their vehicles down the middle of the road. Now let's take a little break from history and see how the miniature is coming along. Adding shadows to a miniature is a very important step, as it improves the level of detail of the painting. As you can see right here, I'm drenching the miniature in Citadel's Nuln Oil in order to achieve this effect. I am adding it over its fur, sword and its jerkin before moving on with the painting. Let's continue. There are ancient sources that tell us that during the first 10 hours of daylight, in most Roman cities, the traffic of vehicles was restricted. There were, of course, exceptions to this. There were 4 kinds of vehicles that were allowed in and out of the cities throughout the day, regardless of daytime or nighttime or any other restrictions. First category of vehicles were, of course, market vehicles, those used in supplying markets, stalls, and bringing goods to workshops such as a butcher's place or a carpenter or any other craftsman. A second kind of vehicles that were allowed within cities at any time were transfer wagons for public buildings. The third kind of vehicles were those used by the clergy, serving temples of different gods and goddesses within city propers. Of course, there were also temples outside of the city, cults that were not accepted within the pomoerium, within the city walls, but that's the story for another time. Now, the fourth and final type of vehicle allowed within settlements at all times were chariots used by circuses or used in triumphs. Again, triumphs were a special celebration. We will discuss this at a later date because I'm sure your players would love to be celebrated in a triumph. We'll get to that at one point. Now, after the first 10 hours of daylight, all restrictions were lifted and all vehicles were allowed in and out of the city with no problem. One last bit of information I'm gonna give you about Roman roads is that within cities and settlements they had crosswalks, as you can see right here. The most examples are found in Pompeii and Herculaneum, both cities buried during the eruption of the Vesuvius volcano in 79 CE, Common Era. And with that, we have finished our journey down Roman roads, but we're not done yet. Before we move on, let's take a look at the miniature. As you can see right here, I am creating a color scale, going from darker shades to brighter shades. This allows me to slowly add highlight, slowly build the difference in nuance and in lighting of parts of the miniature. Right now I am working on the smaller details of the book. I really enjoy working on small details. Let us continue. I wanted to, although I told you that we're gonna visit Northern Africa, the Middle East, Asia and Europe, I'm gonna take you on a surprise trip in America pre-Columbus. And we're gonna talk about the Inca Empire. Although almost 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Inca Empire also created a very impressive network of roads. They didn't know the wheel or metallurgy, but they were still able to create spectacular roads. The Inca road network spanned over 40,000 kilometers or 25,000 miles. Again, we are talking about thousands of miles or kilometers of roads. The roads also had milestones, relay messenger systems that we will be talking about perhaps next video, and of course they had accommodations for travelers at 1 day's worth of travel. The Inca roads measured between 3 and 16 meters or between 10 and 52 feet in width, depending on the importance of the road and the settlements they were connecting. The Inca roads were reserved for the military, for officials on state business, and for llama caravans. Common folk were not allowed to actually walk on the roads, but next to them, and even that was done with special permissions. Although 1,000 years apart, and with the Inca lacking some of the technology that the Romans possessed, they nonetheless created a very impressive road network. It is quite interesting, at least for me, to see how two civilizations that never came in contact and were distanced by 1,000 years evolved in the same direction, at least when it came to infrastructure. With that, we're gonna move on, but before we do, let us see how the miniature is coming along. Right here you can see me working on smaller details of the miniature again, and as before I am creating a scale of red, going from a darker shade to a brighter shade, slowly building up differences in colors and adding highlights. Again, I really like making miniatures pop. Let us continue with a few more details about travel and roads in general. First off, let me try and debunk something of a myth. Before studying history, I was also guilty of this. I truly believed that most people, most common folks, were not that big into travel. In my mind, they were born, they lived, and they died within the same settlement, perhaps visiting the neighboring villages for marriage purposes or for trade purposes. But it turns out that people in ancient times and in medieval times traveled quite a bit. And this is my segue towards explaining what itinerary travel is. This meant that you would travel from settlement to settlement, and upon reaching the next settlement, you would ask around for the road that led in the direction you wanted to go. This was quite easily done because most important roads that link settlements to major cities are named after that city. For example, if you want to go from Edinburgh to London, first off you would have to go down London Road. This would get you more or less in the direction you wanted to go. Once in the next closest settlement, if it were a village with only one main road in and out, it would have been simple, just continue traveling down the road. But if it were a larger settlement, an intersection, you could simply ask the locals for London Road and keep going. You could also ask how long it would take you, but there weren't that many people who actually knew off the top of their head how long it would take them. But it would have been easier to, of course, ask merchants. They usually knew how long it would take to reach major settlements. This is itinerary travel. In a fantasy world, I think this works as well. I'm sure that characters in your world know the capital of the city, if they're not born there or if they don't wake up there. If they want to reach a different settlement and they don't have a map, they could just try and find out the name of the closest major settlement and go from there. From city to city, from settlement to settlement, from village to village, and get in trouble, find adventure, and find treasure. A second myth, or a second idea that I've seen circulating around quite a bit. Travelers would not usually camp in the woods, on the fields, or on the road, as it often happens in fantasy games. Of course, if you got lost, you would take shelter wherever you could. But usually settlements are within one day's travel from one another. So chances are, if you go down one road, within one day you will reach at least a small village. Let's see how the miniature is coming along and then we'll continue. Right here, as you can see, I am adding gold details to the books that the miniature is sitting on. This really makes it stand out. And as you can see, a lot of time goes into painting the books. Let's continue. Another idea that goes hand in hand with that of people not traveling is that roads are usually empty. No, at least not in real life. In real life, on the road you would find everything from simple common folk traveling from one settlement to the other. You would find merchants, you would find mercenaries, you would find soldiers, you would find pilgrims, and you would also find tourists. Yes, tourists are a thing even in ancient times, even in medieval times. Although, usually in medieval times and ancient times, most of the tourists were religious tourists, so they were pilgrims, going to visit different temples or different cathedrals, or trying to visit holy relics. This was quite often. One such pilgrimage is the famous Camino de Santiago route, or the route of St. James, I believe. This was religious tourism. And connected to this, people would actually buy and bring back home souvenirs. Again, most of them were religious in nature, but not all of them. As we nowadays bring fridge magnets, for example, from the places we visit, so did ancient and medieval people, but not fridge magnets. They brought back pieces and small memorabilia from the places they visited. And this is connected to what I've been saying before, that you would find a lot of people on roads. And also, people didn't usually travel alone. This was because you still have wild animals that could endanger travelers. They were highwaymen, and sheer boredom. People don't like being alone, and especially when traveling. And as such, usually you would see people travel in groups or in caravans. And with that, let's take another look at the miniature. Now, with the books being done, or almost done, I am turning back to adding details to the miniature, and right now I am adding silver highlights to the armor pieces. And I am starting to work on the sash the miniature has again around its waist. One more interesting, quite surprising thing, at least for me. While researching about roads from across the world, I've encountered something very interesting that I've already used in my world. I thought I was kind of original. It turns out, not really. In Meghalaya, In India, I'm gonna leave the name right here, one might find a living bridge. This bridge is made of tree roots that have been trained by people over centuries to intertwine and create a living bridge, as you can see in this image. It is quite impressive, at least to me. So, of course, I've adopted it into my own world. Now, let us leave the real world and step into fantasy world. For now, mine. As adventurers travel to the southwestern part of the main continent of my world, they might encounter the Eternal Ebony Bridge, or the Eternal Bond Bridge. This bridge was created by two elvish brothers, both wizards, both kings of two different kingdoms, who wanted to create an everlasting bridge over a strait that spans 30 kilometers. They have planted two ebony trees, and using magic they grew them to enormous sizes. While they were growing, they trained their roots to intertwine and create a bridge, a living bridge over this 30-kilometer strait. But this is, although interesting, this is not the only thing that people come to see when they visit this part of the world. They also visit the hanging markets and inns, or the dangling market or inns, or the danglies. These are actual buildings, inns and taverns and markets, of course, that are built hanging from the bridge underneath it. Spanning over 30 kilometers, usually people spend at least one night in these inns. I'm not gonna tell you their names. Some of them are quite lewd, but you can imagine. This is what people come from across the realm to see. A living bridge. Although it's a world where magic abounds, not everybody can use it. As such, it is quite impressive. And also people come to visit one of the most exotic markets in the realm. So as you can see, I've taken something from reality and introduced it into my fantasy world. My players haven't actually seen the bridge yet, so I'm still fleshing it out, but it's there. So whenever I want to impress them, I just use something from the real world that is so outlandish, so over the top, and so impressive that has to be introduced in a fantasy world. Before we move on, let us see how the miniature is coming along. I'm quite happy with how the miniature looks, and I hope you enjoyed watching me paint it. Right now I'm adding a few more details. And with that, for all you world builders out there, let me leave you with a bit of food for thought. Take a trip down one of your main roads. Who built them? Why? What do they link? How old are the roads? Who maintains them? Who patrols them? Who pays for them? These are a few questions that I asked myself and was able to slowly piece together and flesh out more of my world. And with that, we have reached the end of the road. Hope you enjoyed this little series about roads, and hope you were able to gain a little bit of inspiration or at least learn something new. And with that, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment, hit the bell, and I'll see you all next Wednesday here on Funky Monkey Mini Painting. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers!